Hey there, deep divers. Welcome back. We are diving into a really fascinating article today by Jorge Majfud. It's titled Post-Capitalism and the Absent Father. So right off the bat, intriguing title, right? And Majfud, he argues that we're in this moment, where there's this potential shift towards authoritarianism happening right under our noses. And get this, he says it's fueled by the very system that most people think is the opposite of authoritarian, right? Capitalism. Majfud uses the super interesting metaphor of capitalism as like the absent father. He's saying that, we often deflect the blame for all the shortcomings of capitalism onto other things. It's kind of like when there are issues in a family and we blame the absent parent, for all this dysfunction. To illustrate this whole absent father thing, Majfud points to figures like J.D. Vance. Vance's popularity, it kind of reflects this trend of like favoring individual responsibility over like looking at the system as a whole. But before we even get to Vance, I think it's important to set the stage a little bit. Majfud draws this really interesting historical parallel to like Samuel Huntington's view on the fall of Allende in Chile. So Huntington, he was like this big political scientist, right? And back in the 70s, he was warning against too much democracy.
Interesting.
Right. It's like he was suggesting that too much democracy could actually destabilize societies and even hinder progress. And what's so striking is how the skepticism towards democracy, it kind of aligns with that sentiment we see growing today that favors like efficiency and order. And those things are often linked to, you guessed it, capitalism.
It's true. It's this fascinating paradox, isn't it? The idea that democracy, with its whole emphasis on, individual rights and freedoms, could be perceived as an obstacle to those very values.
Exactly. And that is where J.D. Vance enters the picture. So Vance, right, he wrote Hillbilly Elegy, which is a memoir about the struggles of the white working class in America. And his book really resonated with a lot of people. I mean, it was a huge bestseller. But critics argue that it overlooks these huge, like, systemic issues at play, like, things like systemic racism and poverty. And instead, it kind of just focuses on individual choices and these cultural factors.
Yeah, and that's where that whole danger of the self-made man myth comes in, right? It perpetuates this idea that success is all about, pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, all about individual effort. And it just completely ignores all the systemic barriers and inequalities that actually shape people's opportunities. It ignores, like, their realities and their life chances, And this narrative, it's like what Majfud is saying about the absent father metaphor. Like, if we all believe that individuals are totally responsible for their own destiny, well, then the system itself, in this case, capitalism, gets a free pass, right?
Totally. It's like blaming the players for like flaws in the game itself. We're missing the bigger picture. And what's even more concerning is that this whole narrative distracts us from the real culprit. The real culprit is like the inherent flaws within capitalism that just like perpetuate these cycles of inequality.
100%. But just focusing on like individual shortcomings, we don't address the systemic issues that are really at play.
Why?
It's like we're just treating the symptoms, but not the underlying disease.
Exactly. So, okay, if capitalism is the absent father here, who or what is filling that void? Majfud points to figures like Curtis Yarvin. He's like this tech philosopher who has ties to Peter Thiel and actually J.D. Vance too. And Majfud suggests that these are the figures who are stepping in to offer an alternative vision.
Right. And Yarvin's a very controversial figure, let's just say. He's someone who really believes that you can't have libertarian ideals without an authoritarian structure to like make it all work. I mean, he even says he admires Pinochet, the Chilean dictator. That speaks volumes about his worldview.
Oh, for sure. I mean, that's a chilling thought, to say the least. And it reveals this like dangerous trend that we're seeing where there's this real allure of like strongman figures who come in and promise order and stability, but at the expense of, democratic values.
Yeah, and this is where, the connection to the decline of those traditional democratic values becomes even more clear. When people just feel so disillusioned by how democracy seems to be failing, and that's often blamed on individuals, not the system, right? When that happens, people become way more susceptible to that kind of authoritarian rhetoric and those solutions,
It's like this vicious cycle.
Yeah.
And Majfud, he argues that this shift is fueled in part by capitalism's inherent tendency to create negative value.
Right. And by negative value, Majfud's talking about all those like harmful byproducts of capitalist pursuits.
Yeah.
Things like, just rampant pollution, the crazy inequality, the erosion of social cohesion, all of that.
And it's like these negative values, they're often just like overlooked.
Yeah.
Or they're dismissed as like the price of progress.
Exactly. It's like saying, okay, yeah, sure, the air is toxic and people are struggling, but hey, look at all these amazing products we have.
Yeah.
This disregard for the negative consequences of just unchecked capitalism, that's central to Majfud's whole absent father metaphor.
It really is. Because it's as if capitalism is this distant figure that gets to, like, reap all the rewards but dodges any responsibility for the mess left behind.
Totally. And to make matters worse, this absent father, he's also pretty good at stifling innovation, which sounds counterintuitive, right?
Yeah, you'd think competition would, like, breed innovation, but Majfud's arguing that it often leads to the opposite. So what's going on there?
Well, he says that this constant, like, relentless pursuit of profit, it actually incentivizes companies to go for those short-term gains over the long-term solutions. It's like they'd rather protect their intellectual property and, like, maintain their market dominance
Yeah.
instead of actually collaborating, sharing ideas that could benefit, society as a whole.
So it's less about, like, pushing the boundaries of innovation and more about just protecting those profits and maintaining control.
Exactly. And this is where that absent father metaphor really comes back in, right? Because just like, an absent parent might prioritize their own needs above their children's well-being,
Yeah.
capitalism, at least how it is now, it often prioritizes those short-term profits above the long-term health and sustainability of, society, of all of us.
It's true. And this focus on individual gain over the collective well-being, it just further erodes the foundations of democracy, doesn't it? It creates this breeding ground for the very authoritarian tendencies that Majfud is warning us about.
It really does. It's like this complex web of issues, and understanding that absent father metaphor is crucial to unraveling these dynamics and to recognizing like how urgent the need is for a more equitable and sustainable system.
So, okay, big question here. If capitalism is failing to live up to its promises, what does Majfud propose as an alternative? Does he offer any solutions to this, like, kind of bleak outlook?
Well, that's where things get really interesting, and it's where we'll delve deeper in the next part of our deep dive.
Picking up right where we left off, the good news is that Majfud, he doesn't just leave us hanging with this, like, bleak diagnosis, you know? He actually offers, I think, a glimmer of hope. He highlights the potential of what he calls post-capitalist ideas. But, like, what does that even mean? Post-capitalist? What does a world beyond capitalism even look like?
Yeah, it's a great question. And to be honest, Mashva doesn't really lay out some like detailed roadmap or anything. And I think that's intentional on his part. See, he's not trying to just like prescribe solutions here.
Mhm.
He's more focused on getting us to really think critically.
Okay, so more about prompting reflection than handing us answers on a silver platter.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
But that being said, he does kind of hint at a few key principles that could be helpful, you know, as we try to move toward the future that's more equitable and sustainable for everyone.
Okay, I like it. Give us some specifics, like what kind of principles are we talking about here?
So one of the big ones is recognizing the limitations of that whole self-made narrative we were talking about earlier.
Yeah.
We have to acknowledge the absolutely crucial role of collective action, you know, and social solidarity. Remember that whole absent father metaphor?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Well, Majfud's suggesting that we got to move past this mindset of expecting some singular, like paternalistic figure to swoop in and solve all our problems. And that goes for the government or the free market, right?
Yeah.
They're not going to save us.
So it's more about all of us, right? Like taking responsibility, both individually but also collectively, for creating a society that's more just and equitable.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that we're all in this thing together
Right.
and that my well-being is completely connected to your well-being, is connected to everyone else's well-being.
And this reminds me of what Majfud was saying about the suppression of class consciousness, especially in the U.S.
Oh, absolutely. He makes this point that's so important, which is that when we focus so much on racial and cultural divisions, it often overshadows these shared economic struggles, the struggles that working class people face, across all racial and ethnic lines. We're all in this together.
It's like we're so busy, so caught up in these, like, identity battles that we can't even see the bigger picture, that there are these systemic forces that are keeping us divided and honestly preventing us from, like, uniting against a common enemy.
Exactly. It's like divide and conquer. Right.
Yeah.
And the people in power, the ones who are benefiting from the status quo, they love it. They're more than happy to let these divisions fester, because it just consolidates their power and influence even more.
Right, because then we're all too busy fighting amongst ourselves to, like, challenge the systems that are actually harming us. And this all ties back to Majfud's argument about how capitalism, at least how we know it now, thrives on competition and this hyper-individualism. And that often comes at the expense of, things like cooperation and our collective well-being.
Totally.
Yeah.
It's a system that, at its core, it rewards self-interest. And then it kind of just pits us against each other, which makes it super challenging to even think about building the kind of solidarity that we need for real, meaningful change.
So the million-dollar question, right? How do we break free from this cycle? How do we move past capitalism towards a more equitable and sustainable future?
Majfud suggests that the ones that perpetuate these systems of oppression that keep us stuck. He points to figures like Curtis Yarvin, who we talked about earlier, who are actively promoting those authoritarian solutions and undermining those democratic values.
Right. Yarvin with his admiration for Pinochet. It's scary to think about. It's a reminder of just how dangerous it is to embrace those strongman tactics,
Yeah.
sacrificing those individual liberties in the name of efficiency or order.
Totally. And it's not even just about like outright rejecting those really extreme ideologies. It's also about questioning the more subtle ways that this capitalist logic has like seeped into our thinking
Hmm.
and how it's shaping our values without us even realizing it half the time.
Okay. I like that. So give us an example. What do you mean by that? How is capitalist logic showing up in our everyday lives?
Okay, well, think about how we usually define success, you know? It's almost always in these strictly economic terms. Like, how often do we hear someone praised for being, like, self-made or, for how much wealth they've accumulated? It's constant. And that constant emphasis on individual achievement and, let's be real, material gain, it just reinforces the very values that underpin capitalism in the first place. Now, look, I'm not saying that having personal ambition is a bad thing, not at all. But when it comes at the expense of social responsibility and our collective well-being, that's when it becomes a problem.
I see what you're saying. So it's about finding that balance, right? Between individual aspirations and collective responsibility.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. It's about recognizing that true progress, the kind that benefits everyone, it requires a real shift in values. We have to move away from this relentless pursuit of profit and towards a more holistic understanding of what actually makes a good life.
Right. What does it actually mean to live a good life? And how do we create a world where everyone has the opportunity to achieve that, not just the lucky few? And this is where Mashfud's anecdote about a young J.D. Vance wanting to be a good Terminator, it becomes even more relevant, don't you think?
Absolutely, because it shows how seductive those narratives can be, the ones that glorify power and control above all else.
Yeah.
I mean, the Terminator, right? It's a machine. Its sole purpose is to just eliminate anything that gets in its way. That's a dangerous fantasy. And honestly, it's one we need to be very wary of, especially now as we're facing the legacy of capitalism and the very real allure of those authoritarian solutions.
It's like Mashfud is urging us to really think about the stories we tell ourselves,
Yeah.
about what power means, what success means, and what it even means to be human in a world that's so shaped by technology and this constant drive for profit.
Yeah, 100%. He wants us to at least try to imagine a different future, one where we can move beyond the limitations of that absent father and maybe embrace a way of being that's more compassionate and interconnected.
It's a powerful message for sure, and it feels incredibly relevant right now in this moment. But okay, I gotta ask, how do we translate these big ideas into concrete action? What can I do? What can our listeners do as individuals to challenge these systems, to create a future that is more equitable?
Well, like with so many things, it starts with awareness, right?
Hmm.
When we start to understand the ways that capitalism, even just the logic of it, shapes our thinking, influences our values, that's when we can start to challenge its dominance, and actually envision other ways of organizing society and how we live.
Mm-hmm.
And practically speaking, that might mean making different choices as consumers, supporting businesses and organizations that are putting social and environmental responsibility ahead of just making the biggest profit. Or it could mean getting more involved in political activism, advocating for policies that are really trying to promote economic justice and environmental sustainability.
Got it. So it's about being a more mindful consumer, a more engaged citizen, and just an active participant in shaping the world, right?
Exactly. Because the truth is, we do have agency. We have power, both as individuals and collectively, to create a more just and equitable future for everyone.
And this brings us right back to Majfud's central argument, doesn't it? That need to move beyond that absent father metaphor and really try to grasp in a more nuanced way the forces that are shaping our world, right?
Absolutely. It's not about finding some new father figure, some perfect system or leader to guide us, right? It's about a much deeper shift in our values, a move away from that constant individualism, that hyper-competitiveness, and towards more cooperation and a sense of shared responsibility.
So less about finding a new dad and more about all of us stepping up and realizing we're responsible for each other.
Exactly. It's about understanding that we are all connected, and my well-being is totally bound up with yours, with everyone else's, and with the well-being of this planet we share.
It's definitely a challenging message, but I don't think it's hopeless, you know? I mean, Majfud definitely leaves us with a lot to think about, but he also leaves us with this sense of agency, a call to action. We might not have all the answers right now, and that's okay. But by asking the tough questions, by being willing to challenge the status quo, and by working together, we can create a future that is both just and sustainable for everyone. And like Majfud reminds us, the future isn't some fixed thing, right? It's something that we're actively creating through our choices and our actions every single day.
That's a good way to put it.
So let's try to choose wisely, and let's work towards building a world where the absent father isn't the dominant story, but just a relic of the past, a fading memory. And on that note, that's where we'll leave you today, deep divers with lots to ponder and chew on. Until next time, keep asking those tough questions and keep diving deep.